Yeah, so I think basically I'm speaking here. I'm going to give you the people so just know that it's a minute ago, a minute ago, a minute ago, you know, 1, 2, 6 minutes, 5, 8 minutes, 15 seconds, guys. Anything said very fast, 8 minutes, 15 seconds, 1 20 seconds over a call. Encourage teams to ask your eyes and take your eyes and sit down. So yeah, all of this, guys. Let's put in time, let's put up on the first focus with the yeah.
I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Chair, we believe that it is most sad to say that how every day you pay taxes and every day you're in a nation as a citizen of a country expecting to get justice from and control and protection from the justice system, yet failing to get. We feel like at a point in time when you face something like a violent crime, it is a point in time where the justice system has actually failed you, and we feel like it is a point in time where you actually need to stand up and deliver justice for yourself. So firstly, what I'm going to do in this speech, firstly, I'm going to characterize to you exactly what violent crimes look like. And when we're speaking about violent crimes, we're not talking about just any ordinary crimes, we're particularly speaking of the crimes that cause torture, and these are crimes that are particularly not expected. We feel like violent crimes include things such as gang rape, or things such as things that are detrimental to psychology and actually cause torture onto the victim. We feel like at a point in time when these crimes are actually done, we feel like this is something that can have long-lasting and even permanent effects on the victim, and therefore we feel like there's a need, apart from the current justice system, to actually have an alternative as to how the victim can feel a sense of closure as well as a sense of involvement in the delivery of their own justice, with a sense of understanding as to exactly how things took place, and also a state of being hands-on on the actual state of justice. We feel like when we speak of the victims of these violent crimes, we speak of people who do not have control, number one, of what exactly happens during the crime. We feel like there are people who are vulnerable to their offenders. We feel like at a point in time when you experience this violent crime, you cannot do anything about it particularly. And we also feel like you cannot also do anything about the justice system. They're basically passive to how exactly the justice system runs and how exactly they respond to the crime. So basically what we're trying to say as PROB, we feel like at a point in time there should be a sense of inclusion of the victims to say that they are actually having a chance to be there delivering justice for themselves. Now allow me to move on to proving or showing exactly how this digital world looks like. So this digital world looks like when you have the stimulated consciousness, and this is more like of the same memory of the person that committed the crime. So basically we see that they have the same memories, and ultimately having the same memories means we've got the same reactions to certain things. So what does that then mean? What does that then mean? That then means that this is in actual fact the same person, in to say not physically, but to say that in the digital world it can be the same person in the sense that the victim will understand what the same person, how the same person perpetuated the crime, as well as how exactly they should be doing it. They feel like they get a sense of satisfaction from actually also getting to get justice for themselves. And to tell you that in this system, how we intend to do it, we feel like this the crime justice system should, at a point in time, give permission to the victim to have absolute control of the whole situation. And what we are saying is that they have absolute control on how they're going to handle the offenders of the particular crime, because we feel like there are people who have this sense of trauma and this sense of trying to deliver themselves from psychological issues. Now allow me to jump into my argumentation. So basically I'm going to be proving to you 2 points. Firstly, the point on principle of giving back control to the vulnerable, and secondly, how this promotes victim closure. So firstly, we feel like this gives a sense of control to the vulnerable, in the sense that, as I've just stated, as I have already mentioned in my speech, that this person who is the victim of this whole idea of this crime is someone who's very vulnerable, and someone did not expect the effects. So therefore, we tell you that this then gives them control to actually do things that they were not able to do when they were facing the crime. Particularly, what do we mean by this? Women in the sense that if you were facing a violence in terms of crime, and then you're particularly given a chance to do whatever you want to the person, you can do the exact same thing. And opposition may come and claim that this is something that is going to be wrong, and that this person also does not need to be inflicted pain upon. But we feel like at a point in time when taken.
Would you also abolish the justice system so that victims can directly choose the punishment?
So exactly, it's not about abolishing the justice system. So since I've already mentioned that the justice system is not enough. So basically it's not enough. So therefore we're giving them time to actually go into place and practicality to do things for themselves. So the justice system is not being abolished in this debate. We're not saying the justice system is no longer going to be there, since that would not make sense. But particularly we're saying this is just an addition so that we may see that there is inclusion of the victim and how particularly they feel. Because we feel like the justice system is something that is objective. What do you mean by this? We feel like the justice system has already got its set of standards and its set of punishment that they give to certain crimes. But we feel like in situations of violent crimes, they are subjective and personalized feelings and reaction and emotions toward that. So we feel like if we are given a chance to put you in a world where you can actually control what you do with the offender of your crime, this is something that is going to give you a sense of satisfaction and as well as a sense of justice. And since I've already mentioned that these people are people who are traumatized and people who've got psychological problems, we feel like this is something that is going to cause them to be actually delivered from these psychological problems, because number one, they're going to get the satisfaction of being able to give back what the offender gave to them. So basically, number two, they're also going to have the control basically to understand exactly what the offender was going through to that crime, which is something I'm going to touch further in my speech. Now moving on, I would like to further expand onto exactly why it becomes particularly important to give control to the vulnerable, and which is the people who were offended by the crime. We feel like these people are actually people who need to stand up and also give a justice for themselves that is personal to them. And why do we feel so? We feel like they have faced a lot of stuff and things such as psychological trauma and etc., etc. And we feel like at a point in time where they actually have a chance to say something about it and to do something about it, this is not something we're just going to let pass by. We prove to you how, number two, it promotes victim closure. To say that if you are actively participating in the punishment system and how you are understanding, number one, we get the understanding part to get that the victim understands exactly what the offender was going through. So therefore, our word is not just a word of violence whereby you're just going to inflict the same cause in as much as you're probably going to, but in the long run, you're going to get understanding as to what exactly the offender was going through for them to do what they did. And at the end of the day, what would that mean for you? That would mean that you get a better understanding, and even the way that you're feeling about them might be changed and will be changed in actual fact. And we see that offenders also understand what they put the victims through. And to say that there is a bit of an understanding in the digital world, and if the victim sees that there is an understanding in the digital world, it is something that can be of great satisfaction to them. We tell you that these people are these victims are people who are not just particularly the people who were physically in the crime, but people who were also affected by the crime. What do you mean by this? We feel like the people, like the immediate relatives to the people who were in the crime or who were involved in the crime, who were victims of the crime, we feel like they're also offenders. We feel like they're also victims. To say that in the sense that if a particular crime happened and maybe the victim passed away, you feel like the victim then ultimately becomes the person next to them. Let's look at a particular example of saying maybe where a child was killed or murdered. We feel like the victim of this crime would be the mother. So in any sense, we feel like victims still stand and victims are still there and victims still actually need justice. And what we're offering to you is a world where this justice is not just objective and saying that we can, the justice is, we can give this type of punishment to the offender, because this particularly does not give satisfaction to the victim. But the victim is given satisfaction by actually involving themselves in whatever they're doing. And for that, I thank you.
So I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind, and it has never solved any of the problems that people face. Side proposition comes in and loses this debate when they fail to characterize how actually this is supposed to work. Moreover, they also failed this debate when they actually failed to acknowledge that the justice system actually does work. You're going to get a few things from my speech, a few points on rebuttals and recharacterization. Then secondly, you're going to get our principled argument on how actually this is detrimental to the rights of the perpetrator, and how actually this removes the right that the justice system actually has within status quo, and how this is actually harmful in the whole criminal justice system. Thirdly, you're going to get our pragmatic argument on how this is actually detrimental to closure as compared to what side proposition has brought up. So side proposition comes in and talks about how, oh wait, the justice system usually fails you. It doesn't give you like the right that you deserve, doesn't give you the closure, doesn't give you justice. Well, we don't believe that this is necessarily true, because we have to look at how the justice system is actually designed. Number one, it's designed on a rational note. That is to say, it's very different from a person who's actually facing maybe I was raped or whatever. I'm in an emotional state that leaves me irrational. But then the justice system is rational and has actually taken years to research on the effects that people actually get from criminal offenses such as rape and whatnot. And they've actually found solutions and actually found sentences that actually serve justice, simultaneously helping the person. Moreover, we have to acknowledge that the justice system will never ignore someone who comes in with a rape case. This is rare, and most of the time will actually not happen. So because of that, we believe that people's plies and actually the things that they go through, the justice system will actually deal with them, because that is their job and they've done it so many times. So we don't get why side of proposition then comes in and talks about how, oh wait, this is less likely to happen because of whatever reasons they gave. Moreover, we actually have a few questions. How exactly are you supposed to get satisfaction from actually, maybe you were raped or you're sexually assaulted, you keep on sexually assaulting your perpetrator. Your perpetrator isn't feeling the effects that you also felt, because mind you, this is like different. They are in jail serving a sentence, but then at the same time, you're the one who's inflicting the punishment. You're the one who keeps on remembering the sexual assault that you actually experienced, and because of that, we don't actually see the satisfaction that comes from this. There are other methods that already exist within status quo, such as therapy, where you can actually go and move away from the perpetrator, and because of that, you can actually get the closure that you actually need, which we believe is a better form of closure, which will be extended in my first pragmatic. So, on to our arguments. Well, we have to look at the burdens that side proposition had before we continue. Number one, they were actually supposed to show us why this is actually overall good for the victim, because we don't get the satisfaction chat that they're giving us in the closure chat when you're constantly reminded of the thing that harmed you. Secondly, they are not in line with the criminal justice system. So why exactly would the criminal justice system be incentivized to actually hand out these things that hand out this move? Thirdly, they have to show us how it's principally just when other mechanisms, such as, for example, therapy, or exist within status quo that actually help you in a better way compared as to this proposal. Fourthly, they have to show the aim of the justice system, and why would people the aim of the SCs that are being implemented. Why exactly are they being implemented, and why are more people likely to actually support them? Before I continue, I'll take the POI.
Do you think these individuals are able to truly understand the situation in which these things happened if they're unable to interact with that offender or that victim and have that interaction be in control of them?
Personally, we don't believe that this is actually going to give you control over anything, because this person has already harmed you. What control do you need exactly when that person has already harmed you? That means that even if you were supposed to get a sense of control, that control won't be lasting. You keep on going back and keep on going back. Actually, we believe that when you engage into the SCs, you actually don't have control over what happened to you. They have control over you, because you keep on going back to them and you don't find other methods to actually relieve yourselves from the harm that they caused you. On to our principle. Firstly, we have to notice that our principle is twofold here. Committing the harm, this is actually committing a harm on the digital persona of the person. That is to say that the perpetrator, they already got their sentence, they're already in jail. Maybe if they've done something bad, if someone raped you, maybe they're in jail for like 15 to 20 years. That is to say they're already suffering, justice is already being served to them. Why exactly do we then have to perpetrate them more by actually making sure that their digital persona is actually perpetrated? We don't believe that this is a right thing to do, because we still value the reserve resemblance of a person. This is your conscience. And because of that, we believe that this isn't principally justified, because it's similar to creating deepfakes. Yes, someone may create your deepfakes and do something inappropriate with them. You won't know, yes, but then your digital persona, it's still being violated. And we believe that when a perpetrator has already received the punishment that they're supposed to get, they don't have to get another punishment where even their digital persona is being perpetrated. Moreover, we have to look at the perception of harm and how it actually works. We're talking about how this the justice system actually dictates that justice system actually has two roles. Firstly, they act as a mediator. That is to say, they act as a mediator between the person who was perpetrated and the perpetrator. So they act as a mediator, and this is why we have law courts and whatnot, where they actually like mediate things that are happening, because the person who is harmed is not in the best psychological position to make decisions for themselves, because of the fact that, for example, when you're raped, that's the only thing that you can think about at the moment. But then you get the justice, the person gets the justice that they deserve, simultaneously preventing it from being an overload. Moreover, we have to notice that the purpose of the central justice system is also to provide a punishment that's already proportional to the harm that was inflicted. That is to say, they give sentences based on the harm that was inflicted. It's very different from saying, like, if I were to rob someone's house and if I were to rape someone, those sentences would be marginally different, because they deserve different sentences and they have different social, psychological harms on people. But then if we actually like develop and support the SPs, it means that most people, we won't able to differentiate between the different proportionalities of harm that occur within status quo. And because of that, this actually destroys the justice system and its own objectives. And we don't believe that that is justifiable. Moving on to how this is actually detrimental to victim closure. We're saying that victim closure means that you're over it. You've moved on from it. You've recognized that I was harmed, but then there is more to life than just living in a constant state where I have to kind of hit someone who hit me back again. That's not how closure works. We're saying that, one, causing pain can't help you get closure. Yes, you keep on raping them and whatever using the persona, but then that doesn't help you with anything, because you're still being exposed to it. You don't have control over it, like what side proposition was saying, because the person is already in jail. You don't have control over them, over their actions. It doesn't give you the satisfaction that proposition claims it has. Moreover, healing comes from something that's internally. That means that it comes from going to therapy, talking things out, being away from the thing that harms you. Imagine constantly being in line or in contact with the thing that triggers you. That doesn't help you get closure. It makes you bitter. It makes you resentful. It doesn't help you move on with your life. Thirdly, vengeance has never been the answer, and it's better to get therapy where you actually get your own satisfaction as a person, instead of actually have a situation where you're constantly exposed to that thing that hurt you, because the more you rape that person online, it doesn't matter. It's not going to help you. Moreover, the impacts are, one, you don't forget about them. Two, you relieve your harm constantly. Yes, the raping that was going on, all of it, you relieve it. And because of that, you don't get over it. You don't get your closure. And you don't take other alternatives, because you genuinely, why would you go to therapy when therapy tells you to forget something, but then the SPs actually encourage you to keep on being in contact with the thing that harmed you? It doesn't help. It doesn't help you. It disrupts you as a person. We've never been more than proud to oppose. Thank you.
Okay. My speech will begin in 3, 2, 1. Panel, Lady Justice wears a blindfold because she understands that justice is in and of itself a privilege for all. The tragedy in status quo is that justice isn't dictated by metrics of right and wrong, but the color of my skin and the content of our wallet. We think relying on these failing criminal justice systems will never get the individuals in the worst scenarios of society any real justice we are very, very proud to propose. A few key notes on rebuttal before I go into rebuilding and all of that. I think firstly, there are no to double punishment, right? What Zoe actively comes to tell you in this debate is that no, individuals are already being punished, and we think you violate the rights of individuals by punishing them further. Note how each version of this very same individual isn't experiencing both punishments concurrently. which means there is one version of you being punished within the simulation and another one being punished within the real world. I then don't understand how double punishment is really reasonable insofar as two versions of you are actively experiencing two different things. I think secondly, if the argument in this debate is proportionality of justice, it is always going to fail for two key reasons. Note how we aren't talking about regular crimes here, we're talking about particularly violent ones. We think in most instances of violent crime, rationality in the criminal justice system is exactly what we're fighting. We say at a point where you've actively had someone in your family murdered, rational responses aren't actively something you can access. You ought to experience things like, for example, never hearing the voice of your son again, which the criminal justice system simply cannot punish an individual extra for, but these are still things that affect you within your daily living. We think that the criminal justice system can never truly account for not only how these experiences make you feel, but the ultimate trauma and what you take away from them. We say uniquely that rationality ought to be something that we relinquish within this debate. Finally, their whole point on reliving, we think this just kind of becomes a bit irrelevant because the unique difference between reliving rape and reliving rape within control is just that. You uniquely have control over that scenario and the outcomes of it on our side of the house. We think the fundamental tragedy of something like rape is uniquely that you don't control how that rape ultimately happens, but you can't control what happens to that rapist after the fact. We're going to prove to you that that exact lack of control is what leads to that sidestepping of the criminal justice system that they cried about within their speech. A bit of rebuilding then on our side of the house. What does Tererai ultimately tell you? She tells you that on our side of the house, we give you a level of control that you were never awarded. Control that you weren't awarded when a beloved member of your family was stripped from your household. Control you were never awarded within the criminal justice systems that ought to have protected you within the first place. And I think the principal importance of this is twofold. Number one, the criminal justice system ought to do this for two key reasons. Firstly, you are an active participant within criminal justice, which is to say its existence is actively funded by you and you directly contribute to them. But secondly, we think that at a point where you feel a violent crime, the criminal justice system has ultimately failed you. We think they ought to repay you in whatever means ought to be necessary. We think uniquely on our side of the house, why giving you these means ought to be valued is because these are the only means within our side of the house where you ultimately get control. We say in status quo, the criminal justice system pretends that it ultimately gives you control in sentencing with things like juries, etc., etc. I'm going to prove later down the bench why none of that happens for the most vulnerable within our society. I'll take it.
If you love your principles so much, why not just rape the actual person?
We think that uniquely the criminal justice system ought to still be able to mediate some of these things, and we're going to prove to you on your side of the house why you lose that level of mediation insofar as people aren't satisfied with the justice that they're already getting. Okay, on a few more notes of rebuttal, I think that secondly, her whole thing about the perpetrator not really feeling it is out of this debate as well, because these are the same people with the very same memories. They're probably going to react just as viscerally if you rape them digitally than if they would in the real world. I then don't understand how you can't posit within this debate that they do actively feel these things. We think that isn't relevant. Finally, her alternative coping mechanisms. She tells you about therapy, which, number one, was never exclusive to their side of the house. We think you can still pursue it. I don't understand why you can't. But secondly, I think she actively assumes that trauma is something that is temporary and something that individuals ultimately get out of. We think ultimately on our side of the house, you get better methods to alleviate your trauma because not only are you not guaranteed to go through it through therapy, we at least give you an alternative that may give you a level of closure long term. On to my substantive argument and why criminal justice ultimately fails the most vulnerable individuals within our society. A few key notes on this. We tell you how, firstly, certain individuals are systematically failed by the criminal justice system, which is to say they don't have the very same access to things like courts because they can't ultimately afford these things, and they get things like, for example, individuals who are proximal to the crime stricken out of jury duties. The only individuals who actively understand how these situations occur are usually stricken out for being too proximal to how harms actively exist within the criminal justice system. We think, secondly, people like judges are usually systemically biased, which means if you're in a marginalized community, in most instances, this individual is probably not going to be equally on your side anyway. We say people have two responses to this inequality. Sit there and lack that very same control that they've consistently been robbed, or they take it into their own hands, which is exclusively my reasoning to actively oppose your argumentation. To say individuals don't seek vigilante justice if they don't already feel failed by the criminal justice system. At a point where your rapist will never feel that level of loss of control, we think that's ultimately when you take it out on your streets and do it by yourself. there's two outcomes to this. Number one, uniquely, like things like vigilante justice are completely unregulated, which means I can catch individuals who weren't even proximal to the crime in the crossfire, number one, but number two, ultimately individuals decide who they punish and how they punish them. We think this can even include individuals, for example, like the mothers of rapists, etc., who weren't involved, but the community ultimately feels like they raised a terrible individual. We say on your side of the house, these are individuals who never get that level of protection. I'll take your view.
Okay, let's be realistic here. This individual is still in jail. Nothing has happened to them. Why do I suddenly feel so vindicated when I harass an AI instead of the actual person?
Because look, in most instances, these people don't really get those level of, like, I don't think you can really say that individuals won't be vindicated. I think vindication is something that comes differently from each individual within society. I think if my vindication comes from me raping my rapist, so be it, panel. We think we owe them that very same vindication on our side of the house. We say, secondly, in most instances, again, that criminal justice system can never feel the true nuances of what happens in a violent crime. They don't feel the warmth of your son's bloodshed on your body. They don't feel the absence of him in your household. We say ultimately they can never really punish adequately. We think instead of over-punishing individuals in the real world, we ought to punish these simulations. We say uniquely on our side of the house, we get less criminal justice. Why? Because individuals get to directly impact that vindication, which is something that we tell you within first speech. But secondly, because of that outcome, we think they uniquely are always going to be justified with the criminal justice system anyway, particularly because they chose what was just in that instance. We say this is how you end up without vigilante justice in the real world, something that is ultimately probably going to be way more unregulated and harm way more people on your side of the house. We say, secondly, we actively give individuals access to that deep closure. We say, yes, you can go to therapy, but if therapy isn't working for you, you ought to get it back in blood. We say this is an important outlet for individuals in most instances. Finally, we've already told you how on a principled level that this is something that is owed to you, that you've had your control violated, not only in the action and the motion of that crime, but everything that happened afterwards. You didn't have a control over the sentencing, you didn't have a control of how this individual changed long term. We say on our side of the house, we guarantee you that level of control, and we make sure that it is something that you always have access to. Because of that, because we understand the gravity of these situations, we are so proud to propose.
Okay. May I please confirm that I'm audible if I speak like this? Okay. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. If, like what Christian says, you want to fantasize about harming your oppressor, we are fine with that. Do it in your head. You can imagine it. We think what this debate was always going to be about is what the CJS ought to do. When the CJS is complicit in your fantasies, when your CJS actively gives you some level of vindication in your fantasies and actively commits a harm to somebody who never actually did anything to you, we know that is so harmful. We are so proud to oppose. A few things in this speech then. Firstly, I'm going to give you like 2 things on problem-solution gap. That's why the case from PrEP is going to do this debate. Then I'm going to give you some direct responses. Then an extension as to why the individual who's going to be harmed here was actually not complicit in the harm anyway, and therefore ought not be harmed. But fine then, problem-solution gap here. 2 things. Firstly, on the vigilante justice argument, I just think it's very disingenuous to say that because people want to do vigilante justice because courts are bad and they are so oppressive and they don't give you the ability to like have some level of a justice because you won't actually get a ruling. And in the same breath, they want to use these very same courts to give you the ruling to allow for you to have your simulated consciousness. I think in the same breath, an individual who can't get justice because the court never actually catered for them is still going to do some level of vigilante justice anyway. But secondly, and this is predicated upon the idea that you get some high level of victim closure, but people are going to suddenly stop caring about the people who they've been harmed or have that like level of ability to harm because you've actually been able to like harm them within the simulated consciousness. I didn't posit to them. Right now, I can think about raping someone. I can think about beating them up. Why is it so fundamentally different when you have this level of a simulated consciousness that you're able to get like some level of high vindication? Because under their own stance, they don't want to abolish the justice system. They don't want you to allow you right now to go and punch somebody who punched you because they acknowledge the idea that individuals individuals need some level of proportionality, one, but two, this is something which is actively going to help you. I think what probably becomes true there is that there's still other ways for you to think about these things, but only that could actively give you that vindication is to do it to the actual person, to do that, to know that the person who is sitting in the jail cell right now has actively felt that harm and has felt that level of vindication. You control something which cannot even exist in a world where you actively don't actively have a real harm. The same type of control that you get in your memories, in your fantasies, is the same control you get in this digital world. We need a clear comparative. So it's so far much more better on their side when there's something which loses in the debate from framing. But I want to give a few direct responses here. Firstly, on the idea that the criminal justice system ought to be something which is able to for example, give victims control. I think both sides agree to the idea that individuals actively ought to have some level of fairness and proportionality in their punishment. If the idea was always going to be to give victims control, they would be very happy to just abolish the criminal justice system right now and allow victims to rape people who actively harmed them. But the idea we both concede to in this debate is that the purpose of the criminal justice system is not to give a proportional punishment, or not to give a punishment which the individual would have wanted, but it's to give a fair punishment and to actively allocate punishments in a way that everybody can agree upon. Insofar as that is something which is actively true, I don't understand why it is then the purpose of the CJS to be able to give you the ability to relive out your fantasies. We don't actively have to oppose the idea of living out your fantasies, but we actually are going to do that anyway. But secondly, you needed to prove to us why the CJS as a system, which we already talked to you about, and why it values proportionality, because it was built upon the fundamental idea of rule of law. Nobody is above the law, one, but two, on the idea of actively giving individuals a way of actively going through their punishments, like what Zoe taught in 01 about how we actively studied how we can punish people to most actively, effectively be able to give them level of vindication. We don't the criminal system is based upon principles of fairness. Insofar as they want to talk to you about an unfair punishment, you can unfairly punish them in other different ways. When the CJS becomes complicit, it becomes something which you think is a distinct harm. Second thing here I want to talk about is on the idea of victim closure. Note, insofar as I take out the idea of victim closure, they can't also access things like being able to remove all levels of vigilante justice. Firstly, on Christian's one line about, we can have therapy too, I think that's just probably not true for a few key reasons. One, on a general level of what victims actually prioritize, we both sides agree that victims are likely to not be rational. Insofar as people actively think that me harming this individual is going to give me some level of vindication, why am I in the very same breath when I understand the idea that I can get this level of vindication from harming them? Am I going to actually think about, I'm going to go to therapy? When there's probably going to be some level of trade-off between going to therapy and getting the help that you need and actually being able to get some level of victim closure. But secondly, we posit to you that therapy is actually always about forgetting about the victim, forgetting about the crime, forgetting about the perpetration of that crime, and actually trying to distance yourself from the perpetrator. When these things come as a fundamental dichotomy, you can't both be spending all of your time trying to harm the person who's actively harmed you as well, trying to think about them, trying to gain control over them, and also trying to forget about them at the same time. Within these two things are very much diametrically opposed. Why do you think that therapy is exclusively the best way for you to get over your traumas? For a few key reasons. One, the simulated individual is never going to get you're never going to get vindication for harming a simulation, because either way, you still know on both sides that that person is fine in jail right now, nothing has happened to them. Whether you're somebody who can realistically be able to react to you, it's the exact same thing. You still probably never, there's no way or no actual mechanism as to actually feel some level of vindication when you still know that the person is actively safe within jail within that regard. But secondly, within that, you actively relive your trauma to actively committing that trauma. If somebody beats you up every single day, when you are constantly thinking about beating somebody else up, you're still probably going to be in a situation where you're thinking about that level of trauma. It's something which is always on your mind. When it comparatively, then you're never going to be able to forget your trauma. You're never going to be able to actively get past these things and move on with your life. You're going to be stuck in this paradigm of always being a victim. Only when are you able to escape the idea of being a victim and to become a normal person. We want the best way of victim closure is to move on with your life and become a better person and do better things with your life. On this side of the house, you're stuck in this paradigm of always wanting to get vengeance, always wanting to get the best over the individual who has harmed you. We know that is something which is so harmful. But final thing here about how generally we think that there's two outcomes of an individual committing such a violent crime. But they think they kind of de-emphasize what these types of crimes look like. I think realistically, as an individual, if I shoot somebody, if I strangle them, if I kill them, these are things that actually give you things like PTSD. In the same way that when an individual is a soldier and they harm somebody on the battlefield, they are going to feel that level of trauma from doing that. We think in the same way, if an individual who's a victim of a violent crime is going to be somebody actively tries to go through that crime and do to somebody else, they're also going to experience a mental harm, because either way, most people don't actively have that level, or even in the short term, they might think, I might want to commit this crime, but in the long term, they're going to always remember how they hurt somebody, how they screamed, how they acted, all of these things. And an individual who is actually so evil can deal with those things, but the average victim actually has a good consciousness. They're probably going to actively feel an additional harm for actually being put into a position where they actively had to harm somebody else when it's something which is so harmful. But fourthly, if I want to talk about vigilante justice, if I give somebody the equipment and I literally give them the idea of how they can imagine how I'm going to harm somebody in all these different ways, you actively desensitize them to violence. Even if they aren't going to become traumatized, if they aren't traumatized, they become desensitized. You want to talk about vigilante justice, they're much more likely to actually do things like beat them up on the streets when they actually experience doing it 20 times, as opposed to when they've actually been a person who's never been able to beat somebody up. We need to probably get more vigilante justice on a set of grounds, but even before we get there, if they don't have any level of victim closure, they can't have vigilante justice. They can't have like the eradication of vigilante justice. But final thing that I want to talk to you about is Christian's best response to our proportionality argument is that no, you are harming a different person. You like every single version of that person is different, so you actively don't constitute a harm. I want to posit two things to you. First of all, I think that AI is innocent. I think anything with the consciousness that can feel and breathe and understand things can still actively is completed to a harm. We think still in that instance where you actively have an infinite amount of punishment, which is you, as in you can do what you please, regardless of what you have done, there's still unproportionality because the CJ is actually not going to be able to like delegate as to how you punish them, what form of punishment you actually put upon them. We think on a comparative day, it's still unproportional. But secondly, I think a harm that is completed upon you in a digital space is still a harm. If an individual makes a deepfake of you and uses that type of deepfake and like makes like a pornography video of you, you are still experiencing a harm because your likeness and your ability and like who you are was still violated. We think in that very same way, there's still a violation that occurs when an individual actively violates your likeness because there's still that idea of an individual was thinking about doing all these things to you, one, but two, the government actively gave them like some level of legitimacy in doing that. We're not going to comparative then, you still punish the person who's in jail right now, but you have to think about how that individual is actually doing all of these things for them. In the same way that an individual becomes uncomfortable when somebody is like doing sexual acts to like a deepfake of them or like is using virtual reality to do sexual acts to them, it's the exact same thing. We think you are still complicit to a harm, you still create double punishment when that's something which the CJS cannot buy into. What then do you weigh this debate on? We can acknowledge all of the impacts about why it is so good for you to be able to think about harming somebody. Insofar as down the bench here, they haven't proven to us why specifically the CJS, which is based upon principles of fairness, principles of proportionality, ought to be one which is complicit within this idea of trying to create this level of unproportional punishment or trying to give victims the very same control which they took away. They can't win this debate. They lose from first. So proud to oppose.
Begin my speech with my next word. Heavy is the crown that Mother Justice wears. It's used by systems that never understand the extent to which a crime affects you and once again leaves victims vulnerable to their lives and how this justice is actively rolled out. We ought to enable it, to allow this justice to extend to the extent to which these individuals actively felt that harm and allow those individuals to recover from that. We are proud to propose 3 things I'll give in my speech. First, I'll just respond very quickly to what they actively tell you in terms of direct responses here. But secondly, just note very quickly what kind of strategic concessions that they make on their side of the house. And then lastly, in terms of clashing and rebuilding of our matter. First then, in terms of strategic call-outs, what do we say here? I think it's very weird that in the first half of Zoe's speech, she talks about how, oh my God, this is double punishment, but these individuals say no, but this doesn't actively help you. I think you can't say that you are actively damaging this individual to the extent where it doesn't help you, but say that AI is so important because you are still damaging a person. It's double punishment. You can't actively concede to both things. They had to choose one. But secondly, I think they don't note the role or the purpose to which this device is actively used, because it's not being used to actively say that this person should be up. It's not completely dissociated from what the CJS actively does. It just allows closure to be more proximate to this individual. Because I think in a lot of instances, they never get to interact with those victims. In most instances, they are separated by the system. They never understand this victim's story. They never are able to even tell that victim their story of why it actively harmed them so much. In all those instances, right? We think in a lot of ways, that level of barrier allowed for a lack of closure to actively happen. But second here, not why it's so important, because we think their response to say, oh my God, you can use therapy is so acontextual. Why? Because we think this in and of itself was a form of therapy. We think in a lot of instances you were able to give outlet of the levels of frustration that you had onto this individual by doing this in a much more digital world. Not how the comparative is probably being as frustrated in the real world where you are unable to do this to anyone because that victim is locked behind bars. So that level of frustration, that level of that level to which you are unable to be satisfied by the system is something that you actively carry with you within the systems. We think this in and of itself already proves the level of vigilantism that Christian talks about in his speech. But lastly, note how their engagement was very subpar within that instance, right? Because we think that the ability of the CJS to still be in control of all these things is how it's still able to roll out all this victim closure, but make sure it's regulated to only occur within the digital world. Because we didn't want these individuals to do it in the real world. So that meant that the CJS is still important in how it still rolls punishment for these individuals by putting them behind bars and all this stuff, but it actively stopped individuals from trying to take matters into their own hands in the real world and actively reinforce all this harm to these individuals or more people within the world, right? But lastly, just note on how even their response to our principle was particularly weak here, because the only extent to the response that they give us on our principle is that no, but you already got some level of proportionality. But there are so many different layers of analysis here. Why we tell you it's not proportional? We tell you that all these instances are very nuanced. We tell you that the people that are in control of these systems are very biased. We tell you that in most instances, even if this particularly happens, these individuals can get out. They can get out on parole. They can get acquitted. All these different things that can actively happen in society. We think in all those instances, we prove to you why that level of crime or that level of punishment that's rolled out by the CJS isn't proportional within that extent. We think then we are uniquely able to grant this level of proportionality because this individual regains control that was actively taken away from them. We say this on 3 levels. We say firstly, they were always a passive actor in how this actively happened. They couldn't choose how this action happened to them, how this crime actively happened to them, and those rights were infringed upon them. But secondly, that they couldn't choose the level of punishment that they could give to this individual. So they could only watch as the system actively rolled out what it thought was the best to actively deal with this level of trauma. We think that in and of itself gave them an even bigger justification to take matters into their own hands because they felt unheard, they felt unseen. We think we uniquely were able to give all those kinds of benefits to individuals on our side of the house. We were able to give them control and able to make them active matters within that regard. I'll take that.
If this person is a direct one-to-one copy, either you can A, talk to the person in real life, or B, the direct copy won't talk to you anyway because they never wanted to talk to you.
Look, that's very weird. We don't even think victims are able to go just straight into that prison and actively see those people. That's a weird comparative, right? But note how uniquely speaking, you obviously have control of that digital world that you're in. So obviously, even if that individual didn't want to talk to you their memories, you are able to uniquely force them to do that, to actively talk to them within that regard. But not how this extinct interaction probably makes therapy much, much better than what they actively talk about. Because note, the only level of therapy that they talk about on their side of the house is that someone, a therapist that was a third party within that situation, is able to understand the unique levels of nuances that actively happen within that situation. But secondly, note that it was so much more devoid from what happened, the interactions between this victim and that individual. Note how therapy is much, much better on our side of the house. Because A, not only are you able to get rid of your frustration, but secondly, we don't think that the only action you're able to do with this individual is just commit violent acts, right? We think it extended to even being able to interact with that individual, something that was completely unengaged to, but was said by the first speaker from your first speech. She says these interactions evolve into how you're able to tell your own story on why that particularly harmed you to that extent and force that individual to listen to you. But more importantly, we thought that you were also able to understand probably why that offender probably committed that crime as well. We think so many different reasons as to why that individual had frustrations for that particular offender actively are diluted on our side of the house because you get that catharsis of feeling like you are heard by the individual that actively committed that crime to you. We think we are better for therapy within that regard. In terms of clashes here and how we win, very simply, even in terms of our principle, we think there is an active critical point that exists within here, because we still say the CJS is an active member of how this specific system is actively rolled out, but how it's much more enabled and how it's able to ensure that closure becomes much better within that regard. We think that level of exclusionary benefit was much more important on our side of the house, but not how we are also able to tell you on how you are much more able to probably escape escape being a victim when you are in control of how that actively happens. We thought that was particularly different from when you were unable to control the way in which therapy actively happens, because your therapist chose to focus on what was important within that situation and what was not, on what emotions you could feel within that instance and what was not. When you were actively in control of how, like, you were able to interact with that individual, we felt like that level of control was something that was principally important, because it was that control that was taken away from you in the situation in which you were actively harmed within that degree. What do we say then in terms of like final responses and what like really kills their case within that extent? We think then, like what they uniquely are unable to prove on the other side of the house is how they are unable to get, or how are they able to utilize all the frustrations that individuals feel from not being heard within that system, and how do they actively like deal with all those frustrations when those individuals go back into societies and go back into societies that actively judge them, from feeling so sad over like a very large course of time, right? When they actively go into workplaces and they're still grieving, like so many other individuals could never understand their situation and why they felt that way within that regard. With it, they were only able to truly find that catharsis and get rid of those frustrations when they're able to engage with this individual within that digital world. But lastly here, note how this was so much more important, because when they actively felt judged by the world for feeling that level of grievance, but they could never be in control of that level of action, we thought they felt much more frustrated within that regard. Lastly here, what do we say within that regard, and why do we think like this harm is something that is so important and exclusionary on outside the house? We think not how that individual is so much more important as that version of that individual is the one that's being punished. So we think that level of vindication is something that was so much more prior to outside the house, for that level of justice to just matter, and for mother justice to finally take a course of action in which she would have wanted. We are proud.
Cool. So I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think the idea of a digital persona is the fact that it's not linked to a real person and it exists exclusively as a digital persona. This means when these victims try and violate these perpetrators, it particularly means that the perpetrators are unable to feel these things. It means that they have to take the data of that criminal and then inject it, etc., etc. The digital persona then perceives itself as a real person and it can act, etc., etc. We think it also lives its own independent life from that of the criminal. They tell you that they can get answers from that criminal if they're unlikely to get those responses. But 2, I think it also happens that the victim has to be the one to initiate that harm and has to be the one that then violates this digital persona, right? I think the culture that is then created within those instances is what my first 2 speakers already told you about. It further harms the victim themselves, right? I think the idea of when they talk about victims being victims of things such as gang rape or forced torture and those sort of things, and how they're vulnerable to offenders, they needed to prove that every single victim that they have under their side of the house is a victim that actively wants this type of control that they talk about. But 2, we think they needed to prove how they're going to protect those very same victims at a point in time where the motion says that they're going to act as they please, right? But I also think if these victims are going to be raping their perpetrators back, it particularly means that they are so vengeful within those instances. We're going to show you how this is something which further harms these victims in the first place. But I also think on the chat of victims, they needed to prove why access does not make them vulnerable to things such as psychiatric harm that they talk about in their first speech, right? This is to say that at a point in time where they also then recommit that offense to that very same perpetrator, they're likely to also experience psychiatric harm, particularly because, 1, they're able to understand the situation that perpetrator is. We think that in and of itself, and the fact that they've experienced these sort of things before, it just makes them feel like a terrible person. We don't think that victims should be individuals that are also susceptible to these sort of things, apart from being just a victim, right? But they also talk about the idea
of like victims being included in punishment, right? We think they needed to prove why the criminal justice system should go against what it has always been standing for centuries, right? I think there's a precedent that exists within those instances to say that no one is above the law, right? When we talk about these things, we talk about corrupt leaders and how they're also individuals who should like follow the law within those instances. I think ideally, because these individuals are vulnerable, it particularly means that these sort of harms that they're going to perpetrate on these victims is something which this criminal justice system should also like guard against, right? We think there's justice in that in and of itself, the fact that the criminal justice system was not able to protect you before, but it can still protect you now from those sort of harms that are going to be perpetuated under their side of the house. We think they also needed to prove that victims who are traumatized individuals appreciate the sort of illusion that they're going to be putting them under, particularly because that very same perpetrator is not experiencing the very same things that the victim experienced within those instances. We think this is just an illusion, and these victims are also individuals who are able to recognize that this is just an illusion, right? I think, not taken. I think when they talk about how victims get satisfaction because they manage to punish the offender within like these digital personas, right? I think first, there's this assumption that every victim wants that, right? We don't think that this is something which is particularly true because we have individuals that are victims that just don't want to be associated with things that they view as bad things, right? I think when you talk about victims who are like religious within those instances, they're unlikely to even want these sort of things in the first place, right? Because they give those individuals that sort of platform. I think that in and of itself just means that they don't really care about these victims to begin with, right? But two, I think they actually needed to prove that these individuals get satisfied because they have no way of measuring the satisfaction that these victims are going to have if they manage to get like those sort of satisfaction, right? I think when they talk about how people are not exactly satisfied with the status quo in these sort of things, this is particularly because they're unable to measure the satisfaction in these sort of things. We think this is likely measurable through things such as people protesting against like the criminal justice system or their government within those instances. I still think when that individual is unable to get satisfaction from that type of system, it particularly means they can still protest against like the criminal justice system. And we think what then happens within those instances is they experience harms, things such as desensitization from the sort of crimes that they would have committed to that digital persona, right? I don't think they're able to account for those victims under that side, under that like metrics that they talk about. But also onto their principle about giving back control to like the victims, right? The idea here was when a crime was committed, the victims did not have like some sort of control. But also note when Christian talks about how vindication differs and the fact that it is subjective, we think this is the same thing with like victim closure within those instances. It particularly means their system assumes that every single victim is vengeance and they want to like harm their perpetrators back within those instances, right? We think this also means that they do not feel the control under their side of the house because they recognize that the system, that it's just a system, and they can see the illusion, and they don't feel the control that they're supposed to feel, or the type of lack of control that they would have felt within those instances. This is because when that perpetrator does not feel the harm, but rather mimics that sort of harm, it is something which is just a joke, like to those very same victims, right? We think they needed to prove that the illusion is something which is enough to get these individuals victim closure. They did not do those things. But B, we think if they do cater to those individuals who particularly want vengeance, under our side of the house, we also cater for the individuals who want nothing to do with vengeance and want to forget the whole situation, right? I think then we have to be like very comparative. This means we do not expose individuals that are already vulnerable to more violence and added trauma like they would under their side of the house. The criminal justice system, like if it's so terribly disgusting, we think they can just upgrade, do things such as restructuring, employ other individuals, just not the sort of access, particularly because it is very harmful. I'll take your POI.
Yeah, we already tell you that these spaces can be used to interact with those individuals. So tell us why, if they can't, like if they use them to converse with those people and not use it violently, it's something that's so bad on your side.
Look, you also assume that these individuals are also not vengeful individuals. I think when you talk about how these victims can particularly rape their perpetrators back, that already assumes the idea that the victims under your side are very vengeful. But even within those instances, we still think when you have things such as court proceedings, you can still talk to your perpetrator, you can still understand the reasons why they attacked you and those sort of things, right? I think that idea is useless. But on to victim closure. There's the assumption here that there's a sense of satisfaction that is going to get like these victims closure. But B, we think the subjectivity of how to get victim closure is also something that they forget to talk about. Zoe tells you that this harms victims. We think this only proves that the system that they say is failing is actually playing a joke on these victims, right? It really means if they actually cared, you should be able to do these things to the person in real life. You should go to that prison and then you can re-rape that perpetrator. We think within those instances, that's only when we're able to then get like some victim closure within those instances. But two, not how we will have control over these sort of things. This system allows these victims to act as they please. Because they're individuals who are vengeant, it means that they cannot control how they act or to the extent at which they can go right. We already told you why those things are things which are particularly harmful and we're very proud to oppose.
May I please confirm that I'm audible if I speak like this? Okay. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. If they want to win on Supporti's case shift, they have to acknowledge one thing. Right now, I can go and speak to the person who perpetrated against me. As for example, there are systems in place where if you show remorse for a crime that you have committed, you can have sentences, like you can have years removed from your sentence. There's a system where you can actively go and visit somebody who actively was your perpetrator in jail. They need to prove to us why this is not a debate about like the fictional world and that you can fictionally do in terms of anything you please. I don't think this debate can be about, oh, I'm going to talk to the person who actively harmed me because you can do it on the other side of the house. That was a very, very weird argument for them to run. They lose on that. Now I understand that this debate is likely going to be about things which are outside of the normal, things like actively harming them, things like actively making them into a victim yourself. That's probably what we're going to talk about within this speech. Find them two things in this speech. Firstly, on what is the role of the criminal justice system, but secondly, as to like how do we get some level of victim closure. Firstly, on the role of the criminal justice system, I think both sides make the implicit concession that the CJS is meant to be a mediator, one, but two, the CJS is meant to actively provide some level of proportional punishment. We actively, both sides agree that we actively aren't going to do something like take the person from the street and allow for you to actually do these very same harms towards them. Why then is that very problematic for their case? Down the bench, they talk to you about the idea of control. We want victims to get control. We want victims to get like some level of ability to choose how these situations then are put into place. And at the very same point in time, we understand as both sides that the CJS exists to minimize that control, but we don't want people to actually have an eye for an eye system. Instead of us having things like the Hammurabi Code, where somebody punches me, I punch them back, we're looking at the CJS, which does not actually give you a proportional one-to-one punishment, but a fair punishment, which is done through the lens of the criminal justice system. Insofar, it's probably true then that the CJS is not meant to give that level of like, the role of the CJS is not to reparate victims and to give them like that full level of accountability and to give them all of this power. The role of the CJS was always going to be to provide a fair punishment towards the perpetrator. Down the bench, then I don't understand why then it was so necessary for the CJS to actively give this level of individuals like the ability to vindicate the levels of fantasies. We tell you in O2 that right now inside this call, if I want to think about harming somebody, I can. If I want to imagine them giving me some level of an apology, I can right now. The difference then becomes that it's not something which is facilitated by the criminal justice system, but it's done within like the comfort of your own home. We don't got the comparative there. We think we are fine to have people actively being able to do these things, but since it is actively against what the CJS is built upon, which is actively like distancing the victims from their perpetrators, and something which you can't justify. We think they lose on that front, but we actually don't actually understand what the role of the CJS is within this debate. Second thing here, final thing here, I want to talk about like the idea of like what they don't respond to in O2, and the second independent path to victory. Could you talk to you about the idea about how that consciousness, which is so able to feel things, there was never completely within that harm. We think still the individual who actively committed that harm and the person who's actively going to get that level of punishment are different people. If the CJS is facilitating that punishment, they're doing double punishment. Even if it's not a double punishment, it is an improportional punishment. Because if I actively like punch you and you decide to like shoot me 20 billion times, it's still disproportionate. We think there is still a consciousness there which feels that pain and feels that harm. If I want to argue about how you get so much closure because they have memories and all these types of different things, that to still continue to find that like an individual, a consciousness is still suffering a harm. The role of the CJS is not like to indiscriminately harm people. It was always going to be like like has some level of proportionality, some level of fairness. We think this is unfair punishment. Second thing here on victim closure and how you get victim closure. They posit that you get victim closure through two means. One, by being able to harm your perpetrator back and actually being able to be able to vindicate all of your suffering. But two, by the idea of being able to get more control. Critically, then down the bench, we tell you that this is going to be a false illusion of control. In the same way that if I think about harming somebody, I know that that person was not harmed. Therefore, I don't feel vindication. If I'm harming a simulation of an individual, I know that they're not going to be harmed. There's still going to be a very minimal amount of vindication. Therefore, I don't understand down the bench why you get such great levels of victim closure, and people suddenly going to not want to commit these very same crimes. But secondly, we give you quite a few responses to this. One, on the idea about how this directly is directly against the idea of therapy. Because in therapy, they tell you about the ideas of actually distancing yourself from the victim, going out of that victim mentality, and trying to forget about these types of situations, trying to move on from them. On this side of the house, they actively go through this form of trying to relive it again and again and again, and trying to get some level of control. Therapy or these types of systems were never going to be about control. They're always going to be about actively trying to get out of that victim mentality. On side op is the only side where you're actively able to stop being a victim and able to move on with your life. On side prop, you spend the rest of your life thinking about how you can harm this person more, how you can get back at them. With that level of vengeance, it's never going to be a level of justice. With that vengeance, it's never going to actually make you happy. You're so proud to oppose.
My speech will begin in 3, 2, 1. Panel, when I harm another human being, a principal injustice is done. When I control how that individual reacts to that harm, I imply further principal harms. We think that's something that they ultimately do down the bench. We think we've won this debate very easily. A few key notes. I think first, strategically, it was weird that Kayleen tried to bring United and third, but I'll engage it because I'm benevolent. She has this weird extension about injecting pain into real individuals, but secondly, how these simulations don't ultimately feel pain. I think on a basic level panel, if we can assume that we can give intelligence and feeling to a machine, we can probably give this machine a level of pain. We think that still gives you that same level of catharsis as hurting another human being. We say secondly, that the urge to harm other individuals still exists on both sides of the house. We actively give you better outlets for dealing with that urge. We say you don't go out in the streets and you harm them within a simulation where that other individuals still remain safe from these harms. We say that is why the criminal justice system ought to be complicit insofar as we still allow them to regulate them. We think we win on that clash by a landslide. We say secondly, a lot of their alternatives have big problem solution gaps. I want you to note how their best contention is that this harm and all of this isn't real and their solution is just fantasizing about it. We think fantasizing it is even less real on both sides of the house, but secondly, we think that ultimately you get that level of catharsis when you feel that visceral experience of something real. We think if fantasizing about something was enough, serial killers would just fantasize about killing individuals instead of actively committing that action. We think you ought to have that level of simulation for this to ever be effective. Two key notes then. Number one, why are we ultimately better for victims? We say we are principally better because we ultimately give them a level of control that they were ultimately robbed of. Their best response to this is basically saying that individuals who use that control to ultimately cause harm. We think in most instances, firstly, we've told you down the bench how you don't ultimately have to cause harm. We don't understand how we then force you into the decision of causing harm to other individuals. But secondly, we say that that ought to be something that we're able to do within society insofar as it gives you that control that you so often lacked. The second alternative is to just talk to individuals. And I want you to understand how crazy this is. They want you to talk to them in courts where you have minimal time and are ultimately monitored. Or secondly, they want to talk to you and they are released from prison. We think this ultimately fails for a few key reasons. Number one, that this person has ultimately changed and probably isn't even the same person who harmed you, at least on a psychological level. But secondly, that they have to be released from prison first. We think you ultimately have to stop punishing them in most instances. We tell you a few key things down the bench here. Number one, we give individuals back that level of control, but two, we let them buy into the criminal justice system that for so long has failed them. Their best response is, again, you're going through this very same criminal justice system. Panel, I think failures on the criminal justice system exist within the spectrum, which means failure can look like you giving individual not enough time within prison. We still think this is still a valid failure on our side of the house, something that we ultimately rectify when you are able to take that justice into your very same hands. Finally, the extension on therapy and why this never made sense from the beginning. They say therapy ultimately makes you forget. We think that firstly, this is just inherently untrue. In most instances, you still remember those past traumas. Therapy just helps you get over that. Where we uniquely win on therapy is we ultimately give individuals way more avenues to get over that situation. We say, fine, if this conversation isn't doing it for you, we then give you the ability to even talk to these individuals, number one, or two, actively instill the very same harm that they ultimately instilled onto you. Finally, that idea of them still being the same conscious, we think firstly, again, this is still the mentality of the individual who harmed you, and even these memories are still things that ultimately can be taken from an individual who has already harmed you. I then don't understand why they're fundamentally different individuals from different consciousnesses. We say that still makes it valuable because they're still punishing the same individual who had the mentality, the memories, and the ability to harm you. We say ultimately at the end of the debate, that's what this was about from the very beginning. Insofar as we actively give you the opportunity to do that, we ought to win this debate by a landslide. I finished my notes. Why didn't you thought to write also looking angry? She was also a part of making you angry. I wanted to know this.